Who were the people that paid the price? The very poor, very sick, very young, very old, very weak. The people who had nowhere to go. And that's what happened in Iraq too. This is who I work for. Usually, and it's by no accident, when we see images of Arabs or Muslims in the media, we see young men. They are very angry. They are often dressed in black. They often have their faces covered, so they're hiding something. They're carrying weapons, and they are speaking in a language we don't understand. But do the math with me. Take any country, any group, any population in the world. Not any group, any population or any country. About half men and half women. You add up the women, the girls, and the boys. And the majority of any population, women and children. So the people who pay the price when there's no law and order, women and children. And we don't see those images on purpose, again, because it's easier to hate that masked face. I mean, people have problems in Iraq just like we have problems here. The devastation of the first Gulf War in 1991, and I'm going to focus on three major issues: our use of depleted uranium, destruction of the public health infrastructure, and economic sanctions. Was Iraq a threat to us in 2003? No, Iraq was not a threat to us. And one of the major reasons was our use of depleted uranium during the first Gulf War. That was the first time the U.S. military used depleted uranium, tipped shells, used it in its weaponry. For the first time in 1991, again, well then all through the 1990s, again in 1999 in Yugoslavia, again in the invasion of Afghanistan and through the present, and continuing on in shock and awe through the present. So what is depleted uranium? Radioactive waste is basically what it is. And it's called depleted because what it is that when we or any other country mines uranium, Canada does a lot of uranium mining, that's where we get a lot of our uranium, only 0.7% of what is mined is the isotope that's used for nuclear power. 0.7% for nuclear weapons, nuclear power, what have you. The other 99.3% is garbage. We don't have a use for it. And it's expensive. It starts to add up because they have to pay to store it in big silos, mainly in Colorado where I used to live, but all over the country. So what people found, what Pentagon people found, is that as the most dense material on Earth, when you form it on a rod or you tip it on a missile and you aim that missile at a tank, it will cut through a tank like a hot knife through butter, which is very exciting if you're the Pentagon. But the problem is, first of all, in Afghanistan, we're not hitting any tanks. There aren't tanks to hit. But on impact, depleted uranium, it bursts into flames and it aerosolizes. So like spraying an aerosol spray can. It's there and then it's gone. Microscopic particles that go into the air and into the sand and into the water supply. And it's radioactive. Depleted uranium itself it's a low level of radiation. But the problem with the aerosolization is that you breathe it in and you drink it in if you live in the country where we've used it. So these tiny, tiny particles are tons of microscopic contamination. In 1991 in Iraq, we used over 300 tons concentrated on southern Iraq and Kuwait. It's radioactive. Major Doug Rockey was the Pentagon's #1 go-to guy, geophysicist. I had the honor of speaking with him once, brilliant guy. After the first Gulf War, they sent him to Iraq and said, could you look at what the issues are with what we just did? And so he went and he said, #1, you were never supposed to use this in the first place. We have rules of engagement, if anybody cares, but you're not supposed to use this because it stays afterwards to affect the civilian population long afterwards. So you weren't supposed to use it in the first place. #2, don't ever use it again. #3, you have an obligation to tell the people whom you just contaminated where you used it and how to quarantine it to minimize the effect on them, what they have to do. And #4, every returning soldier needs to be tested for exposure because if they have a service-related disability, they get disability payments. Pentagon said, Doug, thank you so much, you're fired. Those tests, there's a blood and a urine test, and I think it's the blood test that costs about $1,000 a pop. Pentagon isn't going to spend that money on returning soldiers. So that was the end of Doug's career. He became a whistleblower. Now this is a picture from 2003 And these soldiers, I got this off the internet. This is I would call it a trophy picture. These soldiers are irradiating themselves. Now, I've heard from National Guard that they are told about the impact. Don't go near stuff that's been hit, it's hot. But obviously, not everybody's listening, or obviously not everybody's being told. You know, they're not only standing for the photo, they drag the turret up closer to them. They are irradiating themselves. So after the first Gulf War, Life did a special edition photo essay called The Tiny Victims of Desert Storm. Now, you can try, I haven't tried in a while, but I used to be able to access it on the internet. It's gone now. But somewhere there has to be a hard copy of this. The tiny victims of Desert Storm were the children of Desert Storm veterans. Before their service in Iraq, they had normal children. Afterwards, significant increase in the incidence of congenital abnormalities and birth defects. This little one born without extremities. This is like what thalidomide did in the 1960s. And the only risk factor was that his father served in Desert Storm. This little one has spina bifida. This is during the pregnancy, it's the failure of the neural tube, the spinal cord to fully form. So she will never walk. And this little one has something called Goldenhar syndrome, which is a very rare condition. But there just happens to be a cluster of cases among the children of Desert Storm veterans. Now, these individuals are all going to need, I mean, they have disabilities. They need a tremendous amount of care that requires money. But without any service-related disability, and especially these kids aren't going to be paid attention to, the parents get bankrupted. And they would not do further studies to evaluate the etiology of what was going on here. Again, because if it's service-related, the government has to pay out the disabilities. And this is our generation's Agent Orange. The Pentagon will still tell you Agent Orange is perfectly healthy for you. You can eat it off your dinner table. Not so much. Now that's for the maybe 1 million at that time. I have to double check that number. How many service members rotated through Iraq during the first Gulf War? You have 26 million Iraqis who are exposed, and they don't. Depleted uranium does not care if you're in the army or not. What happened in Iraq after 1991 was a 600% increase in Iraq's infant mortality rate and 300% increase in the incidence of pediatric leukemias and lymphomas. These are our victims. Now this little one was lucky enough, I mean, he's got the IV in his foot, he's losing his hair, so he got some chemotherapy. But as I will come to in a minute, with economic sanctions, we blocked food and medicine, which is illegal, but we blocked food and medicine from getting into Iraq. Childhood leukemias are usually a very high rate of treatment, up to 90%, certain types of leukemias, 90% treatable. But what we did was, what it requires is multiple rounds of multiple drugs. And what we did is we would block drugs from going in on the basis that they were dual use, that the regime would use them as chemical weapons. So the fatality rate on the pediatric oncology ward was 100%. The technology is out there to treat these cancers, but we blocked the medicines from going in. This little one got a star for being a good patient. And these were our victims during the 1990s when Iraq fell off our radar. We just weren't paying attention anymore. We have changed how Iraq administers healthcare. Was Iraq a threat to us in 2003? No, Iraq was not a threat, and that's because the public health infrastructure was incapacitated by the first Gulf War. Iraq's medical system, which is something I did not know until I started doing the research, was once known as the jewel of the Arab world. There was like a tourist health industry, people coming to Iraq to get their health needs met by the doctors there. The World Health Organization identified it as a first-class range of medical facilities. So first class, first world, what do our hospitals run on? Electricity. You take the electricity away, you can't run IV pumps. You cannot run surgical suites. You cannot run certain means of checking blood pressure. You cannot deliver health care. So Gulf War damage to the infrastructure, where we targeted electrical grids, we took that away. So there was massive disease outbreak because we also hit the sewage treatment plants, and primary health care and preventative services ceased to exist. They had a good system of health care, and it was free, and we destroyed it. This is in Iraq today.